Ladies and gentlemen, sorry to start a couple of minutes late. We're just making sure that the audio system works as well as it possibly can from the back of the room. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Mark Lidwood. I'm the Director General here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. So welcome to our first public event of our autumn term. If I can just ask you, if you've got a phone, iPod, iPad, any other piece of kit that might make an annoying noise, if you could switch it to silent, I'd be very grateful. We're going to be debating and discussing tonight High Speed 2. Just to give you a short overview of some of the issues involved. Of course, the previous government issued a paper on High Speed Rail link in March 2010, proposed linking London to the West Midlands and then to the north of England. The claim has been that High Speed 2 will produce significant economic benefits, faster journey times, more capacity on existing routes, and a boost to the economies of the Midlands and the north of England. In January 2009, HS2 Limited was established to look at the feasibility of and business case for a new high-speed rail line to consider the case for high-speed rail services linking London, Northern England and Scotland. A subsequent report was delivered to ministers at the end of 2009, which was published in March 2010. On December the 20th, 2010, the government asked HS2 Limited to carry out further work on a Heathrow connection, along with a report on the comparative case for different ways of connecting the West Midlands, Manchester and Leeds, and a public consultation on the proposed high-speed rail strategy and the recommended route for an initial high-speed line from London to the West Mids, concluded in July 2011. The findings are expected to be announced by the Secretary of State later this year. Broadly, it seems agreed that construction, if it went ahead, would be expected to begin in 2017 and completed by 2026. The projected construction costs would be about 32 billion. Suggested projected benefits are alleged to be as high as 44 billion, with revenues perhaps providing another 27 billion. We have a highly distinguished panel to express their views and to, I hope, facilitate an interesting debate this evening. One of whom has already pointed out that this isn't a wholly balanced panel. If you were expecting two advocates for HS2 and two opposed, that's not what you've got. We're hoping that our panellists will express good market reasons for their views to be supportive or not of High Speed 2. I'll introduce our panellists in alphabetical order, which is the order I'm going to ask them to speak in, for around about 7 minutes each. Our first speaker is Kyn Aizlewood, an economic consultant and co-author with our own Richard Wellings of High Speed 2, the next government project disaster, which I hope we've got some copies of somewhere here today, on the desk at the back, if you have not already read one. Kyn holds economics degrees from the University of Nottingham and the University of York. He's a specialist in option appraisal and the development and analysis of strategic, outline and full business cases in often highly complex and political contexts. He co-authored this paper, and the paper found that there's a significant risk that HS2 will become the latest in a long series of big government spending project disasters, higher than forecast costs, lower than forecast benefits. The argument goes that HS2 is not commercially viable, will require substantial and increasing levels of subsidies. Taxpayers will therefore bear a very high proportion of the costs and risks, which are wholly underrepresented, he argues, in the economic case being presented by the Department of Transport. Of course, the paper, when it was released recently, received extensive media coverage on the BBC website, coverage on the BBC News at 10, ITV News at 10, BBC London News, and print coverage in The Times, The Express, The Guardian, The Evening Standard, The Mirror, The Independent, The Telegraph, The Metro, and The Economist. Our second speaker is David Bayliss, OBE, a trustee of the RAC Foundation, a visiting professor at Imperial College, and a transport engineer. David is a joint author of the RAC Foundation's influential Motoring Towards 2050, Roads and Realities, and has opposed HS2 on the grounds that the project is costly and affects only a very small part of the transport market. He said in oral evidence at the Transport Committee on High Speed Rail in July of this year We need a national transport strategy and regional development strategy within which the relative roles of road and rail can be properly judged. At the moment, we have this proposition to spend 30 billion or so of money on rail. National Rail carries 7% of the passenger market in this country and 9% of the freight market. Of that 7%, only about a third is long distance rail. Here we are at a time when we have barely sufficient funds to keep the existing system going, committing huge amounts of money to try and solve the problems on a tiny part of the travel market. It seems to me that in the absence of a proper, thought-through national transport strategy, that is foolhardy. Our third speaker today, and the one who protested about being in a minority of this subject, is Kwasi Kwarteng, the Conservative Member of Parliament for Spelthorne and a member of the Transport Select Committee. Kwasi worked as a company analyst in the city for 7 years and as a journalist before entering Parliament. He was previously the Conservative candidate for Brent East, has been chairman of the Bow Group, and won Spelthorne in May of last year. His latest book, Ghosts of Empire, is about the global legacy of the British Empire. Gridlock Nation, another of his books, examines the potential of dazzling new innovations across the world, from the private sector revolution to Google's new driverless cars. Britain needs a revolution in transport, or gridlock will soon bring the country to a halt, he argues. He believes in markets rather than integrated planning and demands road pricing on the eye-catching ground that tax-funded free roads represent the last gasp of socialism. Our final speaker today is Matt Sinclair, the director of the Taxpayers Alliance. He joined the TPA in 2007, studied economics and economic history at the LSE. Whilst at the TPA, he's produced studies on the NHS, crime, big government projects, the dynamic effects of tax cuts, Gordon Brown's economic record, hate education in Palestine, and environmental policy. And if you haven't read his latest publication, Let Them Eat Carbon, I commend it to you. The TPA, of course, produced research in this area in February of this year, authored by Chris Stokes, and some key findings of that research include that the project will never produce a financial return, it will not cut greenhouse gas emissions, and forecasts for growth in demand for HS2 are overstated and do not take existing evidence or past experience into account. He has said, families will wonder why, with so much pressure on everyone's finances, the government are taxing the poor to pay for a rich man's train. High-speed rail is an incredibly expensive white elephant. It's the wrong project, particularly when the priority should be keeping down the cost to taxpayers and simpler improvements that can cut overcrowding for commuters, not a prohibitively expensive new high-speed line. They need to reconsider their plans and look at more affordable ways of improving the rail network. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your panel for this evening. Kyn, can I ask you to speak first?
Thank you. Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
It's good, it's good. Okay, as the co-author of the IEA report, the report pulled together a lot of existing evidence, and we based some analysis on that and set out a range of conclusions. It's not my intention really this evening to offer an extended summary of that report, so I hope you'd read it yourselves and come to your own conclusions based upon the evidence within it. But we'll offer a brief summary and then move on to focus on 3 key points which perhaps might focus or shape some of the discussion later on this evening. So in summary, we found that HS2 is not commercially viable, that the expected costs vastly exceed the revenues forecast by about £17 billion. So it commits taxpayers and future generations of taxpayers to substantial ongoing public subsidy. The upfront cost commitment of HS2 is huge. It's several times the cost, at least, of High Speed 1, and is equivalent to about £1,000 per UK taxpayer, most of whom will never use HS2. The government forecasts for future demand, and there's a lot of analysis in the report with a lot of detail, but the overall position was that the forecasts made by HS2 Limited, much higher than other industry forecasts, and the entire case seems to rest on the belief that if HS2 is built, that one day enough people will use it. The methodology behind the claim of £2 benefits for £1 cost, which is the headline of the consultation paper, is deeply flawed, is out of date, and it's wholly inappropriate. For example, it assumes that all time spent on a train is entirely wasted. No mobile phones, no laptops, no technology. So it doesn't take account of any of those factors. And finally, the government claims that HS2 will bridge the north-south divide. It's not supported even by the work of HS2 Limited or experts at Imperial College who were asked for a second opinion. HS2 Limited estimates only about 10% of those benefits will accrue from wider economic benefits, for example regeneration, and that the majority of this benefit will be in London, the main destination for passengers who use the service. So there's plenty of detail in the report, and I'd urge you to read that and form your own views on that yourself. But three areas I'd just like to sort of pick up on, shape head towards discussion is, the first question is, should the government be doing this at all? And although there's a good argument that a good economic case for governments to invest in transport infrastructure, there is a question of the best strategy to pursue. So do we sustain investment to make the most of our existing infrastructure, or do we build new? So that's the key question. And how to make it commercially viable. And this is where economics and business sense collides head on, I'm afraid, with politics, because maximising returns on infrastructure sounds deadly dull. Building a new pointy-nosed train, the Concord of the Rails, as an article in Railway Magazine has called it, sounds quite exciting. And most people who pay their taxes really have no idea how government spends their money. I think one of my colleagues is going to pick up some more on that point later. My second point is about the distributional impacts of High Speed 2. Again, should we do this? It's funded out of general taxation, so everybody pays. But 90% of the benefit is said to be to passengers who are paying subsidised fares, most of whom will need to live near one of the new stations, which actually limits benefits to those living in London, Birmingham or one of the northern cities in Phase 2, and actually excludes most UK taxpayers. And research shows that most users of long-distance trains are already in higher pay brackets, thereby distributing from the poor to the rich via subsidy. So in summary, unlike with public spending on defence or law and order or healthcare or education, the vast majority of the people who contribute through taxation will get little or no benefit from High Speed 2. So is this an appropriate use of taxpayers' money? And my third point is about competition. So pushing ahead with HS2, government has easily forgotten lessons that should have been learned from High Speed 1. So I quote from the PAC, Public Accounts Committee report in 2006. It says, in bidding for the project in 1996, LCR forecast that passenger numbers using Eurostar would reach 21 million in 2004. The actual passenger numbers were only 7 million. It's crucial, therefore, that realistic forecasts are prepared from the start. Downside risks need to be given due weight, drawing on both UK and international experience in considering future projects. Sadly overlooked in this case. So what happens when HS2 is introduced? Well, in a market situation, the train operator for HS2, so let's call that HS2 Limited, will compete for passengers with other operators such as Virgin's Pendolino service on the West Coast Main Line. Now, the Right Honourable Philip Hammond, Secretary of State for Transport, has said when talking to business leaders that this is a good thing, and I agree. However, the economic case for HS2 set out in the consultation document and papers prepared by Mr Hammond's department is based on the work of HS2 Limited, which assumes no competition. It implies the creation of a new, large monopoly rail operator providing trains on all routes along the West Coast Main Line HS2 tracks, a service that will maximise benefits to passengers. Now, I have a problem with that in principle, because I think that competition would lead to better service for passengers. However, if there was to be competition, it would drive down prices, and it may result in fewer passengers choosing to use HS2, the premium service. And in that scenario, either way you look at it, the demand to travel on HS2 or the value of future fares is not as forecast in the government's economic case, and taxpayers are going to be left to foot the bill for sustained losses. Now, I don't know what competition will exist for HS2 in 15 to 20 years' time, who does, but the reason HS1 only achieved 1/3 of its predicted passenger numbers was largely attributed to competition, in this case from ferry companies and low-cost airlines. But who knows what competition will be from other rail lines, new uses of technology, electric buses or whatever. What I do know is that the current proposal for HS2 is based on a false premise, and an important lesson from HS1 appears to have fallen on deaf ears. So finally, in wrapping up, I think it's important to look ahead. And sometimes to look ahead, we need to know our past. And I've referred to clear lessons from High Speed 1, which appear to have been overlooked. I'll read even further back in the history of Southeast Asia. There's the story of the white elephant. Now, white elephant represented a valuable but burdensome possession which the owner had to keep, and whose cost, particularly the cost of upkeep, was out of proportion to its usefulness or worth, And in the story, the kings of Siam would make a present of one of these animals to courtiers who they strongly disliked in order to ruin the recipient by the cost of its maintenance. The animals were considered sacred and laws protected them from labour. So receiving a gift of a white elephant from the king was both a blessing and a curse. A blessing because the animal was sacred and a mark of prestige, a curse because the animal had to be retained and could not be put to much practical use, but cost a significant amount to maintain. Now, I mention that story for obvious reasons. The government is heading towards a decision point based on poor economics, fuzzy thinking, and a flagrant disregard for ensuring good value for taxpayers. There are alternatives which improve our transport infrastructure in line with demand at far less cost to the public purse, and which can be implemented within a few years rather than decades, gestation period of white elephants. So I would signpost you to a new website, betterthanhs2.com. So betterthanhs2.com have lots of ideas on how we could do this better. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Chairman. Perhaps I can just add by way of introduction that I spent 25 years of my professional career as Chief Transport Planner at GLC and Director of Planning for London Transport, during which time I was involved in the promotion of a number of rail schemes, some successful. So there's no basic antipathy to rail on my part. And secondly, I was introduced as a trustee of the RAC Foundation, which is correct, but my assessment of High Speed 2 is based upon evidence that I prepared for the Royal Academy of Engineering to help it with its submission to the Parliamentary Select Committee. And this assessment included a number of general concerns, some of which have already been referred to. The small section of the travel market would be affected for such a high cost, the underestimation of existing rail network to accommodate expected growth, the overvaluation of business time savings, the very large risks and uncertainties with a project of this nature and long gestation period, overambitious assumptions about peak high-speed rail frequencies, 18 trains an hour, never been done, negligible or even negative impacts on carbon emissions, business concerns about transport infrastructure being greater in respect of road and air and ports than rail, although there is concern about rail, and I know the British Chambers of Commerce gave evidence to the Select Committee to that effect. The benefits again accruing disproportionately to the better off and London and the South East, and the relief of road congestion, a much greater drain on the economy than rail congestion, would be tiny. However, I want to focus on three rather broader issues. The first is a difference in attitude by government in investment between road, rail and air. Whilst the government continues to forecast substantial growth in road traffic, it has no long-term policy for dealing with this, either by more efficient pricing, which it has set its face against, even preparing during the life of this Parliament, and or improving the road network, other than a few motorway widening schemes and increased use of active traffic management on the most congested sections of the trunk road system. In the recent aviation forecasts, it is made explicit that the assumptions are that there will be no new runways in future, and that is not a consequence of the forecast, that is an input into the forecast. Now, complete contrast to the way in which rail is being looked at. Air having been the fastest growing transport market over the last 3 decades. Rail, by contrast, is approached on a predict and provide basis, despite the recent McNulty report advising, and I quote, that in common with other transport sectors, there should be an end of predict and provide in the rail sector. How can this difference be justified? Whilst there may be environmental arguments for preferring rail over other modes, these are lessening as the performance of road and air transport improves, and there are other powerful arguments, such as the impact on public finances, for preferring road to air and rail. In any event, none of these are so fundamental as to justify the stark difference in philosophy to road and air and rail planning. The second broad issue I want to refer to is the question of the north-south divide. As other justifications for high-speed rail have faded, bridging the north-south divide is now offered as a major benefit. There are at least 2 good reasons for treating this with some suspicion. Firstly, the nature of the north-south divide has not been defined for this purpose, and a clear definition of the problem is needed before the relevance of a proposed solution can be gauged. Secondly, the reduction of rail journey times between central London and the centres of Manchester and Leeds by about 1 hour, both of these already capable of being reached by rail for a day's business, seems unlikely to be a game changer. And there is a risk that the effects would be to drain high-value activities into central London rather than the reverse. Just as the most needy deprived areas of town hamlets in London are unlikely to benefit from high-speed rail, the struggling communities of Bradford, Bootle and Blackburn are similarly unlikely to be better off, and indeed could suffer as their relative isolation is increased as the accessibility of areas close to the high-speed rail termini are improved. If government were serious about using transport investment to reduce regional welfare disparities, this would require a considered multimodal approach coupled with complementary housing and economic development policies. There might be something in transport easing the north-south divide argument, but as presently developed, it does not provide any significant justification for expenditure on this project. Finally, to say a few words about the suitability of high-speed rail to the geography of Britain. Where countries like Britain have already reasonably modern intercity rail systems, high-speed rail is effective in the 300 to 800 kilometre range. Below 300 kilometres, conventional rail, car and coach are most appropriate for most longer journeys, and beyond 800 kilometres, air is dominant. Manchester and Leeds are just 300 kilometres from London and Birmingham, from London, and Birmingham is less than 200 kilometres. To be effective, a high-speed rail system would have to reach beyond Manchester and Leeds, and yet, apart from Tyneside and Teesside, there is little beyond Merseyside, Greater Manchester and West Yorkshire until one gets to the Glasgow-Edinburgh sub-region, a further 300 kilometres to the north. To extend a high-speed rail line over this distance through sensitive areas like the Lake District would be unjustifiably disruptive and expensive. So it has to be concluded that a domestic high-speed rail system is not well suited to Britain's geography. A northwest European network might be a different proposition, but that is not what the government is proposing. As an engineer, I'm excited by the concept of high-speed rail. I've been thrilled by riding on high-speed rail services in continental Europe and Japan. But I'm afraid this proposal is an example of naive enthusiasm over hard-headed reason. Thank you, Chairman.
No, I realise, I used to be a cricketer, and I realise I'm on a very sticky wicket here, given the number of speakers ranged on one side of the argument, which is the opposite of the argument, the side that I'm on. I've served on the Transport Select Committee of the House of Commons for 18 months. I've listened to most of the evidence that has been given with respect to high-speed rail 2, and I have to say that my views have shifted. I was initially very sceptical. Like many of you, I had hard-nosed value for money considerations. I bought some of the ideas about Britain's peculiar geography. But I think on consideration of wider evidence, and having considered the matter, my views changed. And I think that this project, in fact, is exactly what the government says it is. It will be a transformational project for Great Britain. Now let's look at some of the economic arguments. I've seen the cost-benefit or benefit-cost analysis, which says it'll be, for every pound we put in, we will get £2 back. And I appreciate that this is based on extraordinary assumptions. The assumption is that rail demand will increase from now till 2043. If it stops in 2026, there is no benefit, it's 0.7. I've seen those figures. Yet, I appreciate that any input into the model can come up with any answer you want. It is simply the case that it's all dependent. The final figure that you get at the end is completely dependent on the assumptions you make. And it doesn't take an Einstein or even a very sophisticated mathematician to be able to manipulate those assumptions to find the figure you want. So frankly, I find that a lot of that discussion has been futile. So in terms, and that's not to disregard the economic point, but it's also to say that it's very easily manipulable, and you can come up with the answers that you would like. The main objection to the government's assumption is that the government assumes that time saved is an important consideration, and that, as one of the earlier speakers remarked, the government assumes that all time spent on a train is lost time. I'm not sure that this is the case, and of course we know in our lives that train journeys can be very productive. But let's look at the comparative argument. The Transport Select Committee went to France and Germany earlier in the summer, and we heard extensive evidence from people, engineers, local politicians, local businessmen, about the effects of high-speed rail in their countries. Not one person we saw said, you know what, this is a complete waste of time. We recommend that you don't go down this route. Not one person said this. On the contrary, in France and Germany, they were looking to extend the network. The French have got 18 lines, and we're proposing a second line. They've got 18 lines. So in comparison to Britain, they have 5,000 kilometres of high-speed rail, and they want to build more. And local people across France, some are objecting, but the vast majority want the line to pass through their village because they realise that it will be hugely productive and that it will open up opportunities. The Germans equally did not say, let's not do this. In fact, they were extending the network, and they made the important point, which is often forgotten, that the line between, I believe it's Nuremberg and Mannheim, is quite similar actually to our London and Birmingham route. It's about an hour and a half ordinarily, and it was cut, I think, to 50 minutes. And the point they made was that the time saving wasn't actually what was driving the thing. The main argument behind that was a capacity argument. And that's something that the Secretary of State alluded to in his evidence to the committee last week. And it's something that is often forgotten in this debate. There is a massive capacity issue. We need more capacity for freight. And if you speak to Lord Berkeley, who's chairman of the Freight Users Group, he will say this is absolutely vital for capacity so that we can actually use, we can transfer goods around. And someone said 7 or 9% was the figure. That's exactly right. We need to improve that figure. That's why we need more capacity, because it's such a low figure. And the capacity argument is never actually addressed. The North-South divide is a similar argument. Well, of course, there's a North-South divide. They haven't defined it. It's not going to change the North-South divide. But if that is the case, why are northern businessmen fully behind the project? I mean, Labour MPs come up to me and say this will absolutely transform our regions. And they've crudely, I think, characterised the debate between northern jobs and southern toffs, and that's an absurd and very crude characterisation. But there is a demand for this thing in the north. There is a feeling that if we are going to progress as a country, we need to have the infrastructure which will not only put economic development in the southeast, but will actually spread economic development. The idea that it's a rich man's toy, frankly, and that only the rich will benefit from this is a socialist argument. Of course, rich people are going to benefit from it because they're business owners, and actually the benefit will be accrued by people, as the Secretary of State said, in Manchester. If you're a Manchester factory worker, you may never use high-speed rail. That is true. But your job depends on your capacity for the sales force in your business to make deals in London, for international investors to be able to come to Birmingham within an hour or two of landing in Heathrow. It's an international market. Of course a high-speed rail service is going to benefit you, no matter what job or profession you're pursuing. And the idea that we shouldn't do this because it will only benefit a few people is crazy, frankly. I mean, you could make that argument against the 50% tax rate. You can say, well, we shouldn't cut this because it's only going to benefit a few people when we're in austere straits. But anyone who understands anything about economics, but economics 101, as they say in America, would understand, of course, it's going to regenerate the economy. Something that helps people who are who are entrepreneurs, who are investors in capital, is going to help the economy. And that's a fundamental message that we're trying to get across. So yes, you're right to say that some of the assumptions under scrutiny may look a little far-fetched. But I would turn the argument on its head and say that people who are against it have equally arbitrary assumptions, which in themselves don't make much sense. So there's a mixture of populist, socialist-style arguments saying, oh, well, it only benefits rich people. The whole entire network is used by people who are proportionately at the wealthier end of society. This is what the Secretary of State said earlier in his submission earlier this week. And so in a way, you could argue against the whole of rail subsidies on that basis. The idea that we shouldn't be subsidising rail is absurd, because someone talked about the white elephant. I've written a lot about white elephants in my Empire book with regard to Burma, but I'll refer to another historical example. The last time that private capital, and solely private capital, was relied upon to extend the network was, I think, in the 1850s or 1860s. The state has been subsidising rail as long as anybody here has been alive, and longer. And there is no way that we're going to go back to a situation in this country, much as many people might like it, much as many people in this room might like it. There is no way we're going to go back to a situation in which the state does not provide some capital, some financial resources to rail. So having accepted, and which I think most of the people here do, that the state is going to subsidise the rail industry, you've got to look at what the best way that the state can spend its money. And I think that a long-term capital project of this nature is exactly what we need. We're notoriously bad at planning in the long term in this country. We have sticking plaster solutions, and that only makes things worse. What will happen is we might upgrade the Western Main Line and find that that reaches capacity within 10 years. And then this whole debate will kick up again. In 15 years' time, we'll be having the same debate. Mark will still be here, I'll probably still be here. And we'll be saying, ooh, is it now time that we should build high-speed rail? And of course, the answer would have been to have done it 15 years ago, instead of actually debating this now. None of these issues are going to go away. The north-south divide is real. People want to have direct access to London. People want to feel that their communities are being regenerated. The state will subsidise rail for a very long time to come. We have to accept that. And none of these issues, as I say, will go away. So I think that this is a bold plan. Of course there are risks involved. Everything in life, every decision in life involves a risk. But if you balance the risks and the potential benefits, I think that this is an excellent project. I look at other countries and say, not a single one of them has turned around and said, actually, this whole high-speed rail thing was a complete waste of time. The idea that this sceptred isle, uniquely, geographically, is different from Italy, France, Japan, Germany, Netherlands, everywhere else, where they have high-speed rail, is absurd. There's nothing uniquely special about Britain that means we can't have high-speed rail. And my last point is that we're talking about one line. The marginal benefit of one line, this is the equivalent of the Paris-Lyon line. And if you ask any French person, you could ask 100 French people, I'd say probably maybe 2 or 3 of them, if that, would say we should never have built the Paris-Lyon line, connecting the first and second city of that country. That was a uniquely successful project, and we're only at that stage. And to say that it only benefits a few people, of course it only benefits a few. It's only one line in a country of 60 million people. But you've got to start somewhere. And on that basis, the fact that if you were to say we can't do a project that only benefits a few people and doesn't benefit the majority, you would never have built the first canal. You wouldn't have even built the first railway. You wouldn't have built anything. And I don't think that's a serious argument when we're looking at this, an infrastructure project of this nature. Thank you very much for hearing me. I know that I'm literally a lone voice amongst the panel, but I hope you can consider some of my arguments. Thank you very much.
Okay, before I get on to considering some of those arguments, some of those masterful appeals to train envy, I just wanted to... So where my scepticism starts with high-speed rail, because I think the reason why a lot of business groups support this is that they hear it and they say, well, this is transport infrastructure investment, and we like transport infrastructure investment. At least they're not blowing it on diversity advisors, or at least they're not blowing on, at least this is transport infrastructure. The problem is, there's huge pressure on the transport infrastructure budget. The government hasn't swung the public finances decisively behind transport infrastructure. they've concentrated a shrinking transport budget on high-speed rail. And the reason why we're all just talking about one line is because we are focusing enormous resources on that one line. Now, if we start, I think the problem here is that this whole project was conceived, at least the Conservative Party support for it, maybe not Kwasi's, but the Conservative Party support for this was conceived in one act of statist sin. There was this deep desire to find an argument which didn't sound crippling to business for cancelling the third runway, which didn't sound hostile to development. And so the answer was, and this is where my Taxpayers Alliance hat became somewhat sceptical, was we're going to block 13.3 billion being invested by a private company with no expectation of support from the taxpayer, in order that they can get returns from those passengers who enjoy its service. Instead, we're going to invest 15.6 billion of taxpayers' money and another 4.4 billion. Those are the sums at the time. Since then, there's a lot more money going into it. But at the time, it was 20 billion in total, or 15.6 billion of taxpayers' money, so that we can block 13.3 billion of private money. And if that doesn't start anyone off on a tone of deep scepticism about this project, I don't know what could. Now, since then, I've become steadily less convinced, because you see the same old mistakes being made at every stage in this programme. So, overstating demand. Now, this isn't just a matter of your assumptions about the current estimates. It's also about looking at what has happened with past projects. People have done this systematically, not just a matter of, let's go find the railway that suits our cause, because I can do that, and I will later. It's not just those French and German lines they're so happy with. There are plenty of people who are unhappy with their high-speed rail. It's also so we do this systematically. We look around the world, and some Danish researchers did, nice cuddly Scandinavian researchers went out and looked at what has happened in high-speed rail projects. They found that in 9 out of 10, demand was overstated. And it was overstated by an average of 106%. So we're looking here at a systematic error, and we see this, and this is why in projects across the public sector, we are right to start from a position of deep scepticism on major public sector projects, because everyone gets very excited. Everyone goes to Germany or France, sees these very exciting trains, and thinks, we need them here, and then before you know it, all of the pesky criticisms of these things are being swept under the rug as lacking vision, as penny-pinching sticking plasters that don't realise. And so it happens again and again and again. And it happens 9 out of 10 times demand is overstated. I don't think this is the 1 out of 10. I think this is one of the 9. Now, and then it's this big unwieldy project. It's going up here and saying, rejecting sticking plasters in favour of a major project. Now, what the Conservatives have quite wisely said on other projects, like IT projects, is that actually a predisposition that politicians have to a big answer, because it's easy to understand from Whitehall, it's easy to understand is this big project has led to disaster. The NHS supercomputer is the classic example of, we don't want lots more sticking plasters, let's create one big solution which will solve this issue. And it leads to a focus on excessive projects with huge financial risks, and it often leads to disaster, and indeed it did in the NHS supercomputer case. And it will in this as well, so it's supposed to be the thing which solves the North. It's a Londoner's idea of what the North wants. So what they really want is to be able to get here. Well, the North doesn't. If you ask the North in an opinion poll, as we indeed have, you will find that the area most opposed to this, well, so Scotland is very opposed to it. The Scots hate it because it's not going to Scotland. But they
oppose it because they want it.
No, they want to cancel this project. However, one of the areas that's also very opposed to this is the Midlands and Wales. That's an area which is more opposed to it than most of the South. So the idea that this is those rejecting this are also, this is untrue. And I think one of the reasons why people in the Midlands do oppose it so much is that they've heard a lot more debate about it. And the more people hear about this project, the more they dislike it. So the idea that this is us imposing is untrue. Whether or not there are some business events, again, it's because if you're a businessman and you're sitting there thinking there might be some very marginal benefit in this for me, if the money's, but it's being paid for by everyone else. This is a classic issue where we should be careful of claims from business interests about these kinds of things, because they're making a rational calculation that at least this is a project here. But there are plenty of people out there who do oppose it. There's the Black Country Chamber of Commerce, for example. There's no lack of groups who are deeply unimpressed by this project. So I don't think we should do this. So what the North needs, if we say what would the North project would be better for the North, I'd say train connections within the North. Far worse. The West Coast Main Line is one of the fastest and had the most investment of any train line in Britain. We've invested a huge amount upgrading this thing. There are plenty of lines which are just as important, because the most important trains are the commuter ones, are those ones bringing people into cities every day. And those lines are what need to be improved in the North, allowing people to get into and between cities up there, not an improvement in the journey time to and from London. So then we come to train envy. We come to this idea that we're going to end it. And you see this, you see all around the world, you see people trying. So Malaysia did it. It looked at Singapore's biotechnology sector and thought, we're going to have one of those too. And it does exactly what Singapore does. And it turns out that niche was one which Singapore had very well failed, and they went out with this huge bio valley of empty facilities. This classic idea that because people appreciate something elsewhere, we should try and influence this Me Too, HS2 strategy is a fact. And you can see it. You can see in the Netherlands, where their system is facing bankruptcy. You can see it in Spain, where they have just abandoned a line. And so it's no accident. I mean, the US, where they started down this route with the same kind of enthusiasm in the centre, the same kind of enthusiasm in DC. But in the US, where there is a more decentralised political system, it then gets rejected by the communities who can see they might have to pay for it, as these lines don't perform commercially. So plenty of countries have backed off this. Britain is, of this sort of second generation of countries coming to high-speed rail, one of the few which is still pressing ahead blindly despite the huge financial constraints on every other area of spending. So look around the world and it doesn't look so good. I mean, China, they've arrested the minister responsible, and the thing has a quarter of $1 billion worth of debt. In China, it's an asset bubble. They're investing more in everything because they're saving far more than they know what to do with. Trying to emulate their decision-making here, where we have a shortage of capital, is madness. Now, finally, I won't talk too much about the green issue, because there's another event on the 28th of September in this very room about my book, Let Them Eat Carbon, which you can come to if you want to hear about emissions argument. But Oxera say this could well lead to higher emissions than strategic alternatives. So the business case is weak, the public can see it's weak. It's why the public are turning against this. It's why far more people, I think 48% to 34%, would cut funding for this project. And so the government are relying on more and more desperate claims. So when we point out that under their plans, Coventry would get a much worse service, Stoke-on-Trent would get a much worse service, York would get a much worse service, cities across, people in Nottingham and Derby would have to drive out to an East Midlands interchange rather than being able to get a city centre train. When we point out that they're channeling so much traffic onto Euston, a lot of which currently goes to King's Cross, which has better underground connections, that it's going to require, that it's going to lead to a massive overload of that service. They respond with promise after promise after promise, which isn't in their business plan. So they promise that these services in these towns won't get worse. They promise that the 27% above inflation rise in fares that's in their business plans won't happen because of competition. They make all these promises. What they don't tell you is how they're going to pay for them. Now, I can't give you the numbers because they're out in a TPA research note tomorrow, which you should look out for. But if you cost those pledges, we are looking at the cost of taxpayers being far more like double the kind of cost that's in the government plan. So either the government needs to accept lots of people will get a worse service, accept this is going to be associated with higher fares, further pushing this onto being a rich man's train, or they need to go and ask George Osborne for billions more, and he doesn't have it. So finally, to end on the rich man's train, because I think it's not a socialist argument, because free market doesn't mean what's in the interests of the rich. It's very possible statist policies have led to the enrichment of more people, led to the grotesque wealth of more people than capitalism ever has. It's very easy to become extremely wealthy because the state can concentrate benefits for people. Now, the question is therefore whether this state project is going to have wide benefits for lots of people or concentrated benefits for its very fortunate passengers. You just have to look at the business plan to see the vast majority of the benefits we're talking about here, which people are going to pay for in expensive subsidies, are things like time savings for passengers, valued incorrectly, as has been suggested earlier. It's not about whether it's of some value, it's about whether or not you count there as being no value in time on the train. So there's so those benefits are constantly there. The wider economic impacts are small. Therefore, we are talking about a massive subsidy which is going to overwhelmingly benefit a small and very fortunate group of people who regularly take that line which is going to become high speed. It's overwhelmingly accruing to them. So those fortunate people are doing very well at the expense of ordinary taxpayers. Therefore, this is one of those socialist schemes which we are right to criticise in populist terms, and we're right to criticise as being a massive subsidy for the better off. Because yes, the scrapping a 50p tax rate may initially benefit the rich, but so would setting up a grant scheme to give a load of David Cameron's best mates £100 million. There are plenty of schemes, and those kinds of schemes exist all over the world. There are plenty of schemes, and when schemes benefit the rich because of their political favour, benefit the rich because the state is going to step in and spend huge amounts of money to their benefit, not because it's the right project, because there are better incremental improvements that can be made to the rail network. That is when we should oppose it, and we should deploy the full force that those arguments which the socialists deploy so often in error, we should deploy their full force because the public do resent it. They do resent being asked to pay for a white elephant. They do resent being asked to pay for a rich man's train to the tune of billions, and they are right to.